So we talked about kind of the roots of Korean civilization. Here we're going to talk a little bit more about how states are going to be developing. So remember, there was a Chinese presence in northern Korea, these Han commanderies, kind of military colonies that Koreans will come into contact with and learn a lot about Chinese civilization from. But as Koreans become more powerful, they're going to start pushing them out. And by the second half of the 4th century AD, there will be the development of 3 very large or comparatively large states and other polities as well. There's some tribal confederacies and things like that that will be developed in Korea, modern day Korea. Now, in this lecture, we're going to only focus on one of those states, but I just want to point out that there's going to be like 3. So we have the kind of beginnings of a Korean people, but they're not, and there's a connection between them and the state, but we don't have simply one state yet. These states will rule comparatively large territories. These territories will be ruled by a king who governed through officials, so they're borrowing from the Chinese model. The king, though, will have an exalted status, will usually be seen as a priest / shaman who has some kind of connection with the gods. Right, so that's something important to kind of keep in mind, that there is this kind of connection, this parallel with the Tongun story, right? Tongun is kind of a shamanic figure connected to the gods. Kings are the same kind of thing. Kings have this ability to cross that boundary between the natural and the supernatural world. And a lot of times these kings have fascinating origin stories. One of my favorites, one king was said to be hatched from an egg. There was like an egg that came down from heaven, and he was hatched from it. But the key thing here, again, we see this tendency that Koreans will borrow from other places while maintaining their own political independence. And many Koreans look back today to Goguryeo Korea, right? Goguryeo Korea, of these 3 states that we're going to talk about, the others are Shilla and Baekje. Goguryeo is the first Korean established state with comparatively clear and abundant historical records, right? So this isn't like a mythic state that maybe exists. This is something we know a reasonable amount about. And in the 5th century, they would locate their capital in Pyongyang. So you better believe that North Korea puts a strong emphasis on it. And what's interesting too is that the kind of hero of Goguryeo is this guy named Kwangketo. And literally that's not really so much his name, it's like a title that he's known as. It means like guy who expanded a lot of territory, right? He's the king who goes out and conquers a huge amount of territory. So Koreans, interestingly enough, have this idea of this original early Korean state as a militarily powerful state. And that's a kind of a more modern rendition of what Koreans kind of think of him. And you can see it's emphasizing his martial vigor, right? He's got his sword, he's got his armor, he's got a nice intimidating helmet, and a very fine beard and mustache. And here you can see a stele, this kind of stone pillar is called a stele, celebrating his accomplishments, right? So one thing that Koreans look back to is the first state that we know a lot about. They emphasize its military vigor, right? Its military power. And as you can guess from a state that emphasized the military, they had a warrior aristocracy, right? The elites were elites because they were good at war, right? And one thing I should point out, if you look back at like the history of England, you see how the knights would go out hunting and the king often went hunting. That's what warrior aristocracies do because they fight. And when there's not a war going on, the closest thing to fighting is hunting, right? The closest thing to fighting is hunting. So this is a tomb painting that shows us what Goguryeo life was like. And you can see there's a warrior aristocrat out firing on hunting while on horseback, and he's turned around shooting backwards, which is really impressive, right? He's riding a horse at gallop while shooting a bow and arrow, and thus not holding on to the reins, and he's doing it backwards. So that's pretty impressive, and that just shows the kind of warrior achievements of Goguryeo. They also like to have fun. I thought it was interesting that they had this tomb painting of acrobats. And unfortunately, because we don't have captions, we don't understand a lot about the ideas, the religious ideas, but this is clearly some kind of spirit, right? It's this woman with a kind of bird/snake body. And you can see here an early rendition of the phoenix. Now, like I said, Goguryeo was very big. Kwangketo was known for conquering a bunch of land. And you can see that here. This is a modern day map of Goguryeo territory if it was, superimposed on today's China and Korea. And you can see it's a huge amount of territory. Now, traditionally, this has been simply understood to be a Korea kingdom, but in recent decades, China has tried to say this was actually a Chinese kingdom, which is, as a historian, there's a problem just going back and saying, yes, this was Korean or this was Chinese, because it's just kind of anachronistic. Because if you went back to those people and said, are you Korean or are you Chinese, the question wouldn't have made a lot of sense to them. But it's interesting that what has happened today is that China has tried to claim this as Chinese. It wasn't. I think the Koreans have a much better claim to say that this was part of their history. But in any case, my job is not so much to weigh in on that dispute, but I do want to emphasize how, again, this ancient history is still an issue, because China claims this territory, claims this was a Chinese kingdom. That would allow them to claim North Korea and a bunch of South Korea. And some people are arguing that this is being done to prepare for the possible collapse of North Korea, because that would allow China to say, oh, North Korea is ours. We had this historic claim to it. Somewhat in China's defense is that Koreans, when they claim that this gives them part of Chinese territory. Right today, this part is definitely part of modern China, and the Chinese don't like that, right? They don't want to have other people claiming parts of what they see, or is their territory. And it doesn't help that there's a lot of ethnic Koreans who live in this area. So it's really kind of a mess in terms with these claims. But the key thing here is this ancient kingdom, right, which began over 2,000 years ago and ended, about 1,400 or 1,400 years ago. It's still a hot button issue today in relations between Korea and China, because China wants to claim territory that includes Korea, and Koreans want to claim territory that includes China.